Today's critique examines two pieces on the evolution of enterprise AI in finance, specifically the shift from advisory chain of thought, copilots, to an autonomous chain of action, Internet of Agents.
Right.
So to begin, we really need to look at the ultimate end user of this technology first, the human, and how the text envisions their new daily reality before we even touch the technical architecture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the material asserts that the human role isn't eliminated, but rather concentrated into what it calls harder work.
Like governance, right.
Exactly. Governance, defining agent logic, exception handling. It specifically highlights the emergence of these entirely new roles, like agent architects and performance managers.
Well, so here is the thing. The transition of the human role from manual execution to complex exception handling is framed as a natural evolution, but the text currently glosses over the severe operational friction of upskilling an entire finance department.
I mean, it really sounds like telling a workforce that's spent decades doing assembly line manual labor that, hey, tomorrow you're all in charge of robotics maintenance.
That is such a perfect analogy, and that's the main weakness here. The text confidently asserts that humans will shift to doing this harder work, which requires systems thinking and technical understanding, but it treats this massive cognitive leap as like a simple reassignment of duties.
Like updating a job title on LinkedIn.
Right. It completely ignores the reality that a Copilot-era analyst, or, a 20-year reconciliation clerk, does not naturally possess the architectural skills required to suddenly govern autonomous systems.
But wait, is the author really assuming too much agility from traditional finance teams here? I mean, couldn't a company just mandate some comprehensive software training program and force the pivot?
See, that is exactly the trap this text falls into. It assumes that teaching a new software interface is the same as teaching a new fundamental logic.
Oh, interesting.
Think about a veteran accountant. For 2 decades, their entire professional value has been rooted in executing specific processes, right? Balancing ledgers, navigating tax codes.
Spotting numeric discrepancies in a massive spreadsheet.
Exactly. They know how to do the work. But the text is saying they now need to govern agents that do the work. Understanding how a reconciliation works in your head does not mean you know how to write the parameter boundaries or the logic loops for an autonomous agent.
Or the failure thresholds.
Right. A CFO reading this piece is going to immediately look at their current headcount and realize that subject matter expertise does not naturally translate into systems governance expertise.
So the text is describing this beautiful destination, a highly efficient world where humans just supervise digital workers. But it completely skips the incredibly messy middle phase of actually getting the workforce there.
Precisely. So, for the suggestion, the author needs to acknowledge the immense friction of this organizational redesign and introduce the concept of a transitionary skills bridge to ground the narrative in operational reality.
Okay, but what does that look like in practice? Because we need to give concrete examples here.
Right. So if I were editing this, I'd tell the author to explicitly add a paragraph detailing what that change management actually looks like on the ground. Don't just say humans will become agent architects.
Give us the mechanics.
Yeah. Tell the reader that organizations will almost certainly need to hire external engineering talent to build the initial governance infrastructure, because the legacy staff simply cannot do it on day one.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense.
And then show us how a company might take their best legacy staff and put them through a dedicated exception specialist upskilling program. Shadowing the external engineers to slowly learn prompt governance and system architecture.
Wow, okay. That takes the text from being this sort of theoretical manifesto to a really grounded operational playbook.
Exactly. It validates the real-world anxiety of the enterprise leader who is reading this and wondering, how much is this talent acquisition going to cost me?
Right. But this actually brings up an interesting narrative causality. Because even if a CFO successfully upskills their entire finance team to govern these agents, they hit an immediate structural wall.
The data.
The data. The agents have nothing reliable to govern if the underlying data is a mess. So let's look closely at the section discussing the architecture that makes agents work.
Right, the prerequisites.
Yeah, the text outlines very strict technical requirements here. It says you absolutely need a canonical data model, a data orchestration layer, and a clean core ERP. It frames these as absolute non-negotiable prerequisites.
Well, positioning pristine data architecture as a non-negotiable prerequisite for the Internet of Agents is technically sound, but it risks alienating enterprise readers whose organizations are still decades away from achieving a perfect core ERP.
Wait, let's unpack why the author is so militant about this prerequisite in the first place. Why exactly does an autonomous agent mechanically require things like a canonical data model to function?
It's a good question.
I mean, why can't it just read the legacy systems the same way a human analyst does today?
So think about how an autonomous agent processes information versus a human. A human analyst can look at an invoice billed to, say, Corp Inc. in one legacy system, and then a vendor profile for Corporate Incorporated in another.
And they implicitly know they are the exact same entity.
Right. The human bridges the gap with common sense. But an autonomous agent taking action across systems might see those as two entirely distinct entities.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So without human intervention, it might execute a duplicate multi-million-dollar vendor payment, log it in the general ledger, and create a massive reconciliation disaster before anyone even realizes what happened.
Okay, that is terrifying.
It is. That's why a canonical data model, which is just a single universal language and standardized format for all enterprise data, is so crucial. Without it, agents fail in ways that are incredibly fast and super difficult to detect.
Okay, so the author is absolutely right to demand a clean core ERP and standardized data layers, which means if an enterprise has messy, fragmented legacy systems, and let's be honest, almost all of them do, they simply shouldn't deploy agents yet.
Well,
I mean, what's the problem with the text just stating that harsh reality?
the weakness is that framing standardized data and orchestration layers as an all-or-nothing requirement makes the chain of action feel like a distant, unreachable utopia. By stating that agents built on poor data architecture are inherently dangerous, the text inadvertently gives business leaders a perfect excuse to delay agent adoption entirely.
Oh, I see. They'll just throw their hands up.
Exactly. The reader will look at this and say, well, our global ERP consolidation is a 5-year, $50 million project. I guess we can't touch autonomous agents until 2031.
Right. It completely kills the momentum of the piece. So what's the suggestion?
The author needs to soften the absolute nature of these prerequisites by illustrating a phased, localized deployment strategy where agents can still safely provide value in imperfect real-world environments.
Hang on, let me challenge that for a second. Doesn't building a localized, temporary pipeline for one specific agent just create more technical debt?
How so?
Well, if I'm an IT director reading this, I'm going to argue that you're basically telling me to build a mini data silo to fix a macro data silo problem. Aren't we setting them up for the exact unmanageable failures the text warns about if we compromised on the data environment?
No. See, we aren't telling the reader to compromise on the quality of the data the agent receives. We're suggesting they compromise on the scale of the data transformation required to get started.
Okay, I'm listening.
You don't unleash a generalist agent into a sprawling, messy global ERP. Instead, and here is a concrete example the author should use, tell the reader to identify one specific, high-volume, rule-heavy process.
Like what?
Let's use a regional tax database as an example. You build a data orchestration layer strictly for the inputs of that specific tax process. You canonicalize just that tiny sliver of data.
Just the tax data.
Right. Then you deploy a single validation agent that operates autonomously, but strictly within that highly governed, perfectly clean sandbox.
Ah, okay. So instead of boiling the ocean, you boil a single cup of water.
Exactly.
You extract just the data needed for one task, sanitize that specific stream, and let the agent work exclusively within those safe boundaries.
And by adding this localized deployment strategy to the text, you give the reader a way to start tomorrow. You show them that the transition to autonomous agents isn't this massive all-or-nothing switch that requires a flawless global architecture.
Right, it's a capability that can be grown organically, silo by silo.
Yes, as data pipelines are gradually modernized, it shows that localized pipelines aren't technical debt, they are stepping stones.
That is a really fundamental shift in how the reader interacts with the piece. It transforms a daunting theoretical architecture lecture into a highly pragmatic strategy.
Because they walk away knowing exactly where to plant their first flag.
Right. So, having established that both the human transformation and the data transformation are going to be messy, gradual processes rather than immediate absolutes, It's time we look at the core theoretical absolute of the material itself.
The main hook.
Yeah, the central thesis here is that the AI copilot era is over. The text draws a very sharp binary contrast between advisory AI, which it dismisses as merely a rehearsal, and operational AI, which it champions as the performance.
Yeah. So relying heavily on a stark binary contrast between advisory AI and operational AI creates a punchy narrative, but it artificially diminishes the ongoing symbiotic necessity of chain-of-thought systems in the new era.
Because the material repeatedly characterizes copilots as a bottleneck, right? It says they fail to close the action gap.
Exactly. But the weakness here is that this contradicts its earlier point that humans will still need to make complex, context-heavy ethical judgments.
Oh, right, the harder work.
Yeah. The text forgets that when humans are doing this harder work of handling severe exceptions, they will absolutely still rely on chain-of-thought copilots to advise them.
But wait, if we soften this binary, if we stop saying the copilot era is definitively over, do we risk completely destroying the punchiness of the author's main hook?
Not necessarily.
I mean, the entire piece rests on this thematic, revolutionary shift from thought to action. If we say, well, actually, we still need both, doesn't the argument lose its edge? It might sound like every other moderate tech prediction out there.
I really don't think we have to sacrifice narrative punchiness for operational accuracy. We don't have to say the copilot era is still the dominant paradigm. We can confidently say the era of the copilot as the primary operating system is over.
Ah, okay, the primary OS?
Right. The suggestion is to reframe the relationship between the two architectures. The punchiness simply shifts from a story of complete replacement to a story of advanced ecosystem design.
Integrated symbiosis.
Exactly. Instead of presenting the chain of action as the death of the chain of thought, present them as a layered, deeply integrated symbiosis where agents handle the execution and copilots advise the human governance layer.
Give me a real-world analogy for that.
Think about a modern airline cockpit. The autopilot, which is the chain of action, is flying the plane for 95% of the journey.
Right?
But when a massive, unforeseen storm system appears on the radar, the autopilot hits its failure threshold and kicks control back to the human pilot. And what is the first thing that human pilot does?
They immediately consult their weather radar, their wind shear instruments, their advisory systems.
They look at their co-pilots to make the decision.
Exactly.
The advisory systems don't disappear just because the plane can fly itself. They become the critical life raft for the human when the autonomous system escalates a problem.
That makes perfect sense.
So, for a concrete example, the text needs to depict a specific workflow showing the symbiosis in action within a finance setting. Imagine a chain of action anomaly detection agent flags a massive, highly ambiguous treasury risk.
Okay.
The agent realizes the parameters of the risk exceed its localized sandbox, so it stops, and it escalates the issue to a human exceptions specialist.
And that human specialist isn't just going to look at the raw data and guess, because the problem is too complex, which is why the agent escalated it in the first place.
Right, that human then immediately turns to a chain-of-thought copilot. They ask the copilot to summarize recent geopolitical news, synthesize unstructured market data from the past 24 hours, and, model a few potential scenarios based on historical treasury data.
And then the human uses that advisory copilot to interpret the chaos.
Exactly. They decide on the best course of action and then input the resolution back into the system so the execution agent can carry it out.
Wow. It brings the entire ecosystem into a closed loop. The human and the copilot are now working intimately together on the 1% of unstructured problems that the agents simply cannot solve.
And honestly, illustrating that specific symbiosis makes the text so much more sophisticated.
Yeah, it really does.
Because if you tell an enterprise reader that chain of thought is dead, they are going to experience massive cognitive dissonance. They are currently seeing huge value from their advisory AI investments.
Right. They just spent millions on it.
Exactly. But if you tell them, hey, the advisory AI you are using today is about to become your critical lifeline when your autonomous agents escalate a multi-million-dollar discrepancy to your desk, That is a gripping, highly realistic vision of the future.
It honors the massive investments organizations are currently making in copilots while clearly pointing them toward the next evolutionary leap.
Yes, it proves that it's not just about replacing human keystrokes. It's about elevating human judgment and giving them the integrated tools to exercise that judgment effectively when the machines inevitably reach their limits.
This has been a deeply insightful exploration of the text, really moving it from a high-level theoretical manifesto to a grounded operational reality. So let's briefly synthesize the holistic review.
Sure.
The argument for the Internet of Agents in financial operations is highly compelling, but the material can be significantly elevated by embracing the friction of reality.
The overarching takeaway is that visionary architecture demands grounded operational steps. If you want to sell the destination, you have to be honest about the potholes on the road getting there.
Exactly. So to summarize the actionable steps for our listener to implement, first, build the operational bridge. Don't just list new human roles, detail what the grueling upskilling process actually looks like for legacy finance professionals moving into agent governance, acknowledging the likely need for external AI engineering talent.
Right.
Second, provide a localized phase approach for data. Show how organizations can deploy validation agents in tightly ring-fenced, sanitized environments, rather than waiting a decade for an elusive, perfectly clean, core global ERP.
And third, reframe the core binary. Show how advisory chain of thought copilots and autonomous chain of action agents will work symbiotically at the exception layer, rather than treating them as mutually exclusive eras.
Perfect. We warmly invite the listener to revise their work based on these insights and submit the next iteration back to the critique for further review. We'd love to see how this evolves.
Definitely.
And as we close, it's worth remembering, making the leap from following a GPS to maintaining a fleet of autonomous vehicles doesn't happen overnight, and happens one properly trained mechanic and one successfully governed mile at a time.